There are moments in life when you realize that the person you loved most in the world sees you as nothing more than an inconvenience. For me, that moment came on a Tuesday afternoon, when my chest felt like it was being crushed by an invisible hand, and my son looked down at me with eyes colder than winter and said words I will never forget. "It's your time already. I'm Alice. I'm 67 years old, and I raised my son alone after my husband died when Kevin was only 8. I worked 2 jobs for 15 years, cleaning offices at night and waitressing during the day, so my boy could have everything I never did. Piano lessons, summer camps, a college education. I wore the same 3 dresses for years so he could have new shoes. I skipped meals so he could have seconds. I postponed my own doctor appointments, ignored my own pain, because there was always something Kevin needed more. And I did it gladly. That's what mothers do, isn't it? We sacrifice. We endure. We convince ourselves that one day, when our children are grown and successful, they'll remember everything we gave up for them. They'll hold our hands when we're old. They'll say thank you. They'll care. I believed that with every fiber of my being, even when Kevin started visiting less, even when his phone calls became shorter, more distracted, even when he stopped asking how I was and started every conversation with what he needed. "Mom, I need to borrow some money for a business investment. Mom, can you co-sign this loan? It's just a formality. Mom, I'm too busy this weekend. Maybe next month." I told myself he was just busy building his life. That's what I raised him to do, after all. To be independent, successful, strong. I convinced myself that his distance was proof I'd done my job well. He didn't need me anymore because I'd given him everything he needed to thrive on his own. But on that Tuesday, when the pain hit me like lightning splitting through my chest and I collapsed in my own kitchen, I learned the truth that no mother should ever have to face. I had just finished making lunch, a simple sandwich, because I'd been feeling tired lately and didn't have energy for much else. The pain started as a dull ache between my shoulder blades, then spread across my chest like fire. My left arm went numb. The room tilted sideways. I tried to call out, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. Kevin was in the living room. He'd stopped by unexpectedly that morning, which had made me so happy I'd nearly cried. My son, in my home, on a weekday. It had been months since his last visit. I'd made his favorite coffee, asked about his work, tried not to notice how many times he checked his phone while I was talking. When the pain hit, I managed to stumble to the doorway between the kitchen and living room. I gripped the frame to keep from falling. "Kevin," I gasped. "Something's wrong. I need help." He looked up from his phone slowly, as if I'd interrupted something important. His eyes scanned me with clinical detachment, the same way you might look at a stranger asking for directions. "Kevin, please," I said, my voice breaking. "Call 911. I think it's my heart." I watched his face carefully, waiting for the panic, the fear, the immediate action that any loving child would show. But what I saw instead was something that made the physical pain seem almost bearable in comparison. Calculation. He was calculating something in his head, weighing options, making a decision. About me. About whether I was worth the trouble. "Mom," he said finally, his tone flat and matter-of-fact. "You're 67 years old. You've had a good life. Maybe it's just your time already." The words didn't make sense at first. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, for him to laugh and say he was joking, for him to jump up and help me. But he didn't move. He just sat there, looking at me with something like impatience, as if I was being dramatic and inconvenient. "Kevin, I'm serious. I can't breathe properly. Please." "You're probably just anxious," he interrupted, turning his attention back to his phone. "You always worry too much about your health. Remember last year when you thought you had pneumonia and it was just a cold?" My legs were shaking. I could feel sweat beading on my forehead despite the coldness spreading through my limbs. "This is different. I know my body. Something is really wrong." He sighed. Actually sighed, as if I was the most tiresome person in the world. "Mom, I have an important meeting in an hour. I can't take you to the hospital right now. If you're still feeling bad tonight, I'll send you the number for that urgent care place. If I'm still feeling bad tonight," as if a heart attack was something you could just wait out like a headache. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab him and shake him and demand to know what had happened to my son, my sweet boy, who used to hold my hand and tell me I was the best mom in the world. But I couldn't speak anymore. The pain was too intense, spreading through my chest like broken glass, and my vision was starting to blur at the edges. I slid down the doorframe, my back against the wall, and ended up sitting on the floor. From this angle, I could see Kevin's expensive leather shoes, his designer jeans, the watch I'd helped him buy for his 30th birthday, even though it had cost me 2 months of my pension. "Don't be dramatic," he said, still not looking at me. "You'll be fine. You're tougher than you think." Then he stood up, stepped over my outstretched legs like I was a piece of furniture in his way, and walked toward the front door. I heard his keys jingle. I heard the door open. "Kevin," I whispered, though I knew he probably couldn't hear me. The door closed. He left me there. My son, the person I had loved more than life itself, the child I had built my entire existence around, had looked at his mother having a heart attack and decided she wasn't worth missing a meeting for. I don't know how long I sat there on that cold kitchen floor. Time became strange, stretching and compressing. I focused on breathing, shallow, painful breaths that felt like inhaling shards of ice. I thought about calling 911 myself, but my phone was in my bedroom, impossibly far away. I thought about crawling to the neighbors, but I wasn't sure I could make it. Mostly, I thought about Kevin. I thought about the night he was born, how I'd held him and promised I would always protect him, always love him, always be there. I thought about his first day of school, how he'd cried and clung to my leg, and I'd reassured him that everything would be okay. I thought about the time he broke his arm falling off his bike, and I'd stayed up all night in the hospital holding his hand while he slept. I thought about every sacrifice I'd made, every dream I'd deferred, every piece of myself I'd given away to make sure he had more than I did. And I realized with devastating clarity that all of it, every single moment, had been invisible to him. Or worse, it had been visible, and he simply didn't care. The neighbor, Mrs. Chen, found me. She'd come over to return a dish I'd lent her the week before. When I didn't answer her knock, she tried the door. I never locked it during the day, a habit from better times when I felt safe in my own home. She found me barely conscious, slumped against the wall, my lips turning blue. "Alice! Oh my God, Alice!" Her voice sounded far away, like she was calling to me from the bottom of a well. I felt her hands on my face, heard her shouting into her phone, felt the solid floor beneath me as the last of my strength gave out. The last thing I remember thinking before everything went dark was, he really meant it. My son really wanted me to die. If you like emotional stories that touch the heart, please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and it helps our work so much. And comment which city you're watching from. Your support means everything to us. I woke up in the hospital 3 days later. The first thing I saw was white ceiling tiles and fluorescent lights that hurt my eyes. The second thing I noticed was the steady beep of machines monitoring my heartbeat, a sound that confirmed I was still alive, even though part of me had died on that kitchen floor. A nurse with kind eyes came to check on me. She explained that I'd had a serious heart attack, that Mrs. Chen's quick action had saved my life, that I'd been unconscious for most of the first day. She spoke gently, as if she could sense that the physical damage wasn't the worst of what I was dealing with. "Is there anyone we should call?" she asked. "Family? Your emergency contact lists a Kevin Morrison as your son." The mention of his name sent a different kind of pain through my chest. "No," I said, my voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd removed. "Don't call him." She looked at me with a question in her eyes but didn't push. I was grateful for that. How could I explain that my emergency contact was the reason I'd nearly died? That the person who was supposed to love me most in the world had decided I wasn't worth saving? Mrs. Chen visited me every day. She brought me magazines, helped me eat when my hands were too weak to hold the fork, and most importantly, she listened. On the 4th day, when I finally had the strength to talk about what had happened, she held my hand and let me cry. "He said it was my time," I told her, the words still burning like acid in my throat. "He looked at me dying and decided it was convenient." Mrs. Chen's face hardened with an anger I'd never seen from her before. "That boy," she said, and there was steel in her voice. After everything you did for him, I gave him everything, I whispered. Everything I had. Everything I was. And it still wasn't enough to make him care whether I lived or died. What I didn't tell her, what I could barely admit to myself, was that part of me had seen this coming. Not this exactly, but something. The signs had been there for years, hadn't they? I'd just been too desperate to believe in the fantasy of the grateful son to see the reality of the man he'd become. Kevin didn't visit me in the hospital. Not once during the 10 days I spent there recovering. The nurses asked about him a few times, and I made excuses. He was busy with work, he lived far away, he didn't handle hospitals well. Lies that tasted bitter on my tongue, but were easier than the truth. He did call, though. On day 7, my phone rang and his name appeared on the screen. My heart, my broken, patched-up heart, leaped with pathetic hope. Maybe he'd realized what he'd done. Maybe he was calling to apologize, to explain that he'd been in shock, that he hadn't meant those terrible words. "Hi, Mom," he said, his tone casual, like we were continuing a normal conversation. "Mrs. Chen told me you were in the hospital. I've been swamped with work, or I would have called sooner. Swamped with work. Not, I'm sorry I left you to die. Not, I was wrong. Just an excuse wrapped in indifference." "I had a heart attack, Kevin," I said, testing him, giving him one more chance to be the son I'd raised. "Yeah, I figured it was something like that. You've always had that tendency to overreact to every little pain, but I guess this time it was actually serious. Every little pain. As if the years I'd spent ignoring my own health problems to take care of him were evidence of weakness rather than sacrifice. The doctor says I need to take it easy for a while," I continued, hating how small my voice sounded. "I'll need some help when I come home." There was a pause. A long, calculated pause that told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke. "Here's the thing, Mom," Kevin said, and I could hear him shifting into what I called his business voice, smooth, reasonable, utterly cold. "I've been thinking about your situation. You're not getting any younger, and living alone clearly isn't safe for you anymore. What if this happens again, and Mrs. Chen isn't around?" "I can manage," I said quickly, fear beginning to creep up my spine. I've been looking into some facilities," he continued, talking over me like my words didn't matter. "Nice places, very clean, with medical staff available 24 hours a day. Wouldn't that be better than struggling to take care of that big house all by yourself?" A facility. He wanted to put me in a home. The house I'd lived in for 35 years. The house I'd raised him in. The house I'd nearly worked myself to death to keep. He wanted to take it away from me. "I don't want to go to a facility, Kevin. I want to go home. To my home." "Be realistic, Mom," he said, impatience creeping into his voice. "You can't handle the stairs anymore. The maintenance alone is probably too much for you. And honestly, it's not like you need all that space. Wouldn't it be simpler to let it go? Let it go. Let go of the only thing I had left. The only place in the world that was truly mine. We can talk about this when I'm better," I said, trying to end the conversation before I started crying. "I need to rest now." Sure, he said quickly, clearly relieved to hang up. "Take care of yourself, Mom. We'll figure this all out soon." The "we" in that sentence felt like a threat. After I hung up, I lay in my hospital bed and stared at the ceiling, replaying the conversation in my mind. Something about it felt wrong beyond the obvious cruelty. The way he'd had those facility options ready to discuss. The way he'd emphasized that the house was too much for me. The way he'd said, "We'll figure this out," with such certainty, as if my opinion was merely a formality to be managed. Mrs. Chen came to pick me up when I was discharged. She helped me into her car with the gentleness of someone handling something precious and fragile. I felt both. Precious because someone actually cared whether I lived or died, and fragile because I'd learned exactly how easily everything you love can be taken from you. When we pulled up to my house, I saw Kevin's car in the driveway. My stomach dropped. "Do you want me to stay?" Mrs. Chen asked, her hand on my arm. "No," I said, though I desperately wanted her to. "This is between me and my son." I found him in my kitchen, sitting at my table like he owned the place, papers spread out in front of him. He looked up when I walked in, and I saw something flicker across his face. Was it guilt? Relief that I'd survived? Or just irritation that I'd interrupted whatever he was doing? Mom, he said, standing up quickly and shoving the papers into a folder. You're home. I thought I'd stop by to check on things. Check on things. Not check on me. Things. What are those papers? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Nothing important. Just some documents I needed to review. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. How are you feeling? You look tired. Maybe you should rest. I was tired. Exhausted, actually. But something in my gut told me not to leave him alone in my house, not to go upstairs and leave those papers unattended. I'm fine, I said, moving slowly toward the table. What kind of documents? His smile faded. Mom, don't worry about it. It's complicated financial stuff. You know you've never been good with that kind of thing. Never been good with that kind of thing. I'd managed 2 jobs, raised a child alone, kept a household running on almost nothing for decades. But according to Kevin, I wasn't capable of understanding complicated financial stuff. I reached for the folder, but he grabbed it first, holding it against his chest like a shield. Mom, seriously, you just got out of the hospital. You need to rest, not stress yourself out over paperwork. Kevin, I said, my voice harder than I'd ever used with him before. Show me what's in that folder. We stood there, mother and son, staring at each other across a distance that had nothing to do with the few feet of kitchen floor between us. In his eyes, I saw something that made my blood run cold. He wasn't going to show me because he knew I wouldn't like what I saw. You know what? He said finally, his voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. I don't have time for this. You're being paranoid and difficult, which honestly isn't surprising given your age and what you've just been through. I'm trying to help you, but you're making it impossible. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, the folder still clutched in his hand. At the doorway, he turned back. We need to have a serious conversation about your future, Mom. Soon. Because whether you want to accept it or not, you can't keep living like this. You're going to end up dead on that kitchen floor, and next time there might not be anyone around to save you. The door slammed behind him, and I stood alone in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd collapsed, where he'd stepped over me, where he'd decided my life wasn't worth his time. But this time, something was different. This time, underneath the hurt and the betrayal, I felt something else stirring, something that felt almost like anger. No, not anger. Something colder, sharper, more dangerous. Clarity. Kevin wasn't just a neglectful son. He was planning something. And whatever it was, it involved taking away the only thing I had left. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Kevin's face as he clutched those papers, heard his voice saying, "We need to have a serious conversation about your future." Like my future was something he had the right to decide. I got out of bed slowly. Everything was slow now, my body reminding me with every movement that I'd nearly died, and went downstairs. The house felt different somehow, violated. Kevin had been alone here for who knows how long while I was in the hospital, going through my things, planning whatever he was planning. I started in the living room, looking for anything out of place. At first, everything seemed normal, but then I noticed small things. The drawer in the side table wasn't completely closed. The stack of mail on the console had been moved. I always kept it in a specific order, oldest to newest, and now it was jumbled. Someone had been searching through my things. In my bedroom, I found more evidence. My filing cabinet, where I kept important documents, had been opened. I could tell because I always locked it and kept the key hidden in an old jewelry box. The key was back in its place, but the papers inside had been rifled through. My birth certificate, my marriage license, my husband's death certificate, the deed to the house. All of them had been touched, examined, maybe even copied. My hands shook as I pulled out the deed. The house was in my name. Only my name. I'd made sure of that after my husband died, wanting to know that no matter what happened, I had this one solid thing that belonged to me. Kevin had no legal claim to it, but that didn't mean he wouldn't try. The next few weeks passed in an uncomfortable routine. I recovered slowly, learning to manage stairs again, learning to recognize the warning signs my body gave me when I was overdoing it. Mrs. Chen checked on me daily, often bringing soup or casseroles, refusing to let me thank her properly. "You'd do the same for me," she said, and I realized with a pang that I would. That's what neighbors did. what human beings did for each other. It was such a simple kindness. Yet Kevin had made me feel like asking for help when I was literally dying was an unreasonable burden. Kevin didn't visit, but he called. Oh, how he called. Every few days, always with the same message wrapped in different words. Just checking in, Mom. Have you thought any more about those facilities I mentioned? Mom, I was talking to a friend whose mother is in assisted living, and she says it's wonderful. So much less stress. You know, Mom, at your age, you really should be thinking about what makes sense long term. Each call made my jaw clench tighter. He never asked how I was feeling. Never asked if I needed anything. Every conversation was just another sales pitch for why I should give up my home and my independence. Then came the visit from his wife, Rachel. I'd always had a complicated relationship with Rachel. She was polite enough, but there was something cold about her, something calculating. She'd married Kevin 5 years ago, and I'd tried so hard to welcome her, to be the mother-in-law I'd want if I were in her position. But she'd kept me at a distance, showing up for obligatory holidays and leaving as quickly as politeness allowed. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon, dressed expensively as always, carrying a bouquet of flowers that looked like they'd been grabbed from a grocery store display at the last minute. "Alice," she said, air kissing near my cheeks. You look like you've been through something terrible. We've been so worried." We, as if she and Kevin were a united front of concern. "I'm recovering," I said, leading her into the living room. "Would you like some tea?" "Oh, no thank you. I can't stay long." She perched on the edge of my sofa like she was afraid it might be contaminated. "I actually came because Kevin and I have been talking, and we really think it's time to have a frank conversation about your situation. My situation. Not my health, not my well-being. My situation. Kevin mentioned you were looking at assisted living facilities," I said carefully. "Well, yes, but it's more than that." Rachel leaned forward, her voice taking on that patronizing tone people use when they think they're being kind, but are actually being condescending. "Alice, you're not a young woman anymore. This house is too big for you. The upkeep alone must be exhausting. And after what happened, what if you have another heart attack? What if you fall down those stairs? It's not safe for you to be here alone." Every word felt like a small knife, cutting away at my autonomy, my competence, my right to make my own decisions about my own life. "I appreciate your concern," I said, keeping my voice level. "But I'm managing fine. Mrs. Chen checks on me, and my doctor says—" "Mrs. Chen is elderly herself," Rachel interrupted. "What happens when she can't help you anymore? Kevin and I have demanding careers. We can't be running over here every time you need something." I wanted to laugh. They'd never run over here when I needed something. Kevin had literally let me nearly die rather than miss a meeting. "No one's asking you to," I said, an edge creeping into my voice. Rachel's expression hardened slightly. "We're trying to do what's best for everyone, Alice. For you, so you're safe and cared for. And honestly, for us too. The stress of worrying about you is affecting Kevin's work. He can barely concentrate at the office. The stress of worrying about me." Kevin, who hadn't worried enough to call 911 when I was having a heart attack, was supposedly so consumed with concern that it was affecting his career. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked. "We've found a wonderful place. Garden Springs Retirement Community. It has full medical staff, activities, other people your age for socialization. You'd be so much happier there, Alice. And it would free you from all the burden of maintaining this place. And what happens to my house?" Rachel's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in her eyes. "Well, obviously you'd need to sell it to pay for Garden Springs. These facilities aren't cheap, but Kevin and I would help coordinate everything. We'd handle all the paperwork, the real estate agent, everything. You wouldn't have to stress about any of it." There it was, the real plan. They wanted me to sell my house, the one thing I owned outright, the only financial security I had, to pay for them to warehouse me somewhere I didn't want to go. "I'm not selling my house," I said firmly. Rachel's smile finally cracked. "Alice, be reasonable. You can't afford to keep it and pay for proper care. And let's be honest, you're not going to get better. You're only going to need more help as time goes on. Wouldn't you rather make this decision now while you still can, instead of waiting until you have no choice?" Until I had no choice. The threat was barely veiled. "I think you should leave now," I said, standing up despite the way it made my heart race. Rachel stood too, her expression shifting to something uglier. "Kevin said you'd be difficult about this. He told me you've always been stubborn, that you never listened to reason." "Reason?" My voice rose despite my intention to stay calm. "You're asking me to give up my home, my independence, everything I've worked for, and you're calling it reason?" "We're trying to help you," Rachel snapped. "God, Kevin was right. You're so ungrateful. After everything he's done for you." "Everything he's done for me?" I felt something break loose inside me. All the pain and anger I'd been holding back suddenly flooding out. What exactly has Kevin done for me? He let me nearly die on my kitchen floor. He hasn't visited once since I got out of the hospital. The only thing he's done is try to convince me to give up my home so he can, what, sell it and pocket the money? Rachel's face flushed. "That's not... You're twisting things. Kevin has been working so hard to find solutions for you. Solutions that benefit him, you mean? You're being paranoid and ungrateful," Rachel said coldly, grabbing her purse. "Kevin said you'd gotten difficult in your old age, but I didn't realize how bad it was. We're only trying to do what's best for you, Alice. But if you're going to be stubborn and irrational, then fine. Deal with it yourself. Just don't come crying to us when you end up back in the hospital with no one to take care of you." She left in a cloud of expensive perfume and barely contained rage, slamming my door hard enough to rattle the windows. I stood in my living room, shaking, partly from anger, partly from the adrenaline that my damaged heart couldn't quite handle. But underneath the physical reaction, something else was happening. I was starting to understand. This wasn't just about Kevin being a neglectful son. This wasn't just about him finding me inconvenient or embarrassing. This was calculated. This was a plan. They wanted my house, probably had wanted it for a while, and my heart attack had given them what they thought was the perfect opportunity to push me into giving it up. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention. I went through my financial documents more carefully. I checked my bank accounts, my credit cards, everything I could access online. And that's when I found the first real proof that something was very, very wrong. There were charges on my credit card I hadn't made. Small ones at first, $50 here, $80 there, that I might have missed if I wasn't looking carefully. But as I went back further, I found more. Hundreds of dollars charged to stores I'd never shopped at, restaurants I'd never eaten at, and the signature on the authorization forms, scanned into my online account, looked like mine, but wasn't quite right. Someone had forged my signature. Someone who had access to my documents, who knew what my signature looked like, who could practice until they got it close enough to fool a cashier or a bank employee who wasn't looking too closely. Kevin, my son, was stealing from me. I sat at my kitchen table with months of credit card statements spread out in front of me, and I felt the last piece of the mother I'd been crumble away. The woman who'd made excuses for him, who'd believed in him despite all evidence to the contrary, who'd clung to the fantasy that underneath it all, he still loved me. That woman died right there among the papers documenting her own son's betrayal. But someone else was being born. Someone harder. Someone who'd been pushed far enough that she was finally ready to push back. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those credit card statements, those forged signatures, the careful calculation behind each theft. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't a one-time mistake. Kevin had been systematically stealing from me for months, maybe longer. I tried to tell myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe he'd borrowed my card in an emergency. Maybe I'd given him permission and forgotten. But even as I grasped at these desperate justifications, I knew they were lies. I'd never given him my credit card. I barely had enough money for my own expenses. Why would I let him charge things to an account I could barely afford to pay off? The truth sat in my chest like a stone. My son was a thief. And judging by the escalating amounts, he was getting bolder. By morning, I'd made a decision. I needed to know exactly how bad this was. I called my bank and requested complete records for the past 2 years. Every transaction, every statement, everything. The customer service representative said it would take a few days to compile everything and mail it to me. "Actually," I said, a thought occurring to me, "could you hold those documents for me to pick up instead? At the branch? Of course, Mrs. Morrison. May I ask why? Because I didn't trust that Kevin wouldn't intercept my mail. Because I'd noticed that some of my recent bills had gone missing. Because I was starting to realize that the level of betrayal might go even deeper than I'd imagined. Just more convenient for me, I said. While I waited for the bank records, I started documenting everything. Every suspicious charge, every missing document, every conversation with Kevin that had felt off. I wrote it all down in a notebook I kept hidden under my mattress. Dramatic, maybe, but I'd learned not to underestimate what Kevin might do if he knew I was onto him. Mrs. Chen noticed the change in me. She came over with lunch one afternoon and found me at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and printouts. "Alice," she said gently, setting down the containers of food she'd brought. "What are you doing?" I looked up at her, this woman who'd saved my life, who checked on me every day, who'd shown me more genuine care in a few weeks than my own son had in years. And I decided to trust her. "Kevin is stealing from me," I said simply. Her face went still. "Are you sure?" I showed her the credit card statements, pointed out the charges I hadn't made, the signature that wasn't quite mine. I told her about the papers he'd been holding, about Rachel's visit, about the pressure to sell my house. Mrs. Chen listened to everything, her expression growing darker with each revelation. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "What are you going to do?" she asked finally. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But I'm not going to just let him take everything from me. I can't. This house, my independence, it's all I have left. You have more than you think," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "You have your strength. You have your mind. And you have people who actually care about you." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Whatever you decide to do, I'm here." Those words meant more than she could know. For so long, I'd felt completely alone, isolated by Kevin's increasing distance and manipulation. Knowing that someone was on my side, that someone believed me and supported me, gave me courage I didn't know I still possessed. 3 days later, I picked up the bank records. They were worse than I'd feared. Much worse. The unauthorized charges went back 18 months and totaled nearly $30,000. $30,000 that Kevin had stolen from me, charged to credit cards that I was responsible for paying. Money I didn't have. Money that explained why I'd been struggling so much lately to make ends meet, why my modest savings had dwindled to almost nothing. But it wasn't just the credit cards. As I went through the records more carefully, I found other things. Checks written from my account that I hadn't written, transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, even a loan application, denied, thank God, that had been submitted in my name. Kevin had been trying to borrow money using me as collateral. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot, staring at page after page of evidence, and felt something inside me go very cold and very still. This wasn't just theft. This was a systematic attempt to drain me of every resource I had, to leave me so financially destroyed that I'd have no choice but to do what he wanted. And I understood now what he wanted. For me to sell my house, sign over the proceeds to pay for some facility where I'd be warehoused until I died. And probably, if I looked into it carefully enough, he'd managed to set himself up as the beneficiary of whatever was left over. My son wasn't just stealing from me. He was trying to erase me. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out the boxes from the back of my closet, the ones containing photos and mementos from Kevin's childhood. I needed to understand when this had started, if there had been signs I'd missed, moments when I could have changed the trajectory of who he'd become. There were pictures of birthday parties, school events, family vacations we'd scraped together money for. In every photo, I could see myself, younger, more hopeful, devoted to this child I'd thought would be my legacy. And there was Kevin, smiling at the camera, looking like any normal, happy child. But as I went through the photos chronologically, I started to notice things I'd been too close to see at the time. The way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes in later photos. The way he'd stand slightly apart from me, even when we were supposedly posing together. The way he'd look at the camera rather than at me, as if I was just a prop in his life rather than the center of it. There was a photo from his college graduation. I'd worked double shifts for months to afford a nice camera for the occasion, had been so proud of him in his cap and gown. In the picture, I was beaming at him with pure joy and love. He was looking past me at something else, his expression not proud or grateful but impatient, as if this moment I'd sacrificed so much to give him, was just an obligation to get through. How had I not seen it then? I found cards he'd given me over the years. Birthday cards, Mother's Day cards, Christmas cards. I opened them now with different eyes and saw what I'd refused to see before. They were generic. Store-bought sentiment with nothing personal added. Most of them just had his signature, nothing else. No love you or thank you or any words that suggested genuine feeling. There was one exception. A card from about 8 years ago, when he'd just started his first real job. Inside, he'd written, "Thanks for all the support, Mom. I'm going to make you proud and pay you back for everything. Pay me back." Even then, he'd seen our relationship as a transaction. I'd invested in him, and he'd acknowledged the debt. But somewhere along the way, he'd decided that debt was negotiable, or that he'd paid it off simply by existing, or maybe that I was the one who actually owed him for the burden of having to have a mother at all. I put the photos away, but I kept that one card. I needed the reminder that Kevin had always seen me as something to extract value from, not someone to love. The next morning, I called the credit card company and reported the fraud. It was one of the hardest phone calls I'd ever made. The representative was kind but thorough, asking questions I didn't want to answer. "Do you know who might have had access to your card information?" "My son." A pause. "And do you want to press charges?" Did I? Could I? The representative explained that to get the charges reversed, I'd likely need to file a police report. That meant officially accusing Kevin of a crime. That meant potentially having him arrested, prosecuted, creating a permanent record of what he'd done. "Can I think about it?" I asked. "Of course. But Mrs. Morrison, I should tell you, cases like this, when it's family, they can be complicated. Sometimes people let it go because they don't want to hurt their relative. But that just enables the behavior to continue." After I hung up, I sat with that thought. Enabling. Had I been enabling Kevin his whole life? Making excuses for his selfishness, his lack of empathy, his increasing cruelty? Had I created this monster by loving him too much? By never holding him accountable? By always putting his needs above my own? Mrs. Chen found me crying at the kitchen table an hour later. "I did this," I told her through my tears. "I made him this way. I never said no. I never set boundaries. I just kept giving and giving and giving, and I taught him that it was okay to just take and take and take." "No," Mrs. Chen said firmly, kneeling beside my chair and taking my hands in hers. "No, Alice. You were a good mother. You loved your child. What he chose to do with that love, how he chose to treat you, that's on him, not you. You don't get to take responsibility for his cruelty." But I wasn't sure I believed her. How could I not be responsible? I'd raised him. Every choice I'd made, every lesson I'd taught or failed to teach, had shaped who he became. "My daughter lives in California," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "She calls me every week. She visits twice a year. She tells her children stories about their grandmother, about the sacrifices I made raising her as a single mother after her father died. You know why?" I shook my head, unable to speak. "Because I taught her that love is a circle, not a one-way street. I gave to her, yes, but I also taught her that part of growing up meant learning to give back. I showed her, by example, how we care for the people who cared for us. You didn't fail to teach Kevin that, Alice. He just chose not to learn it. But what if I could have done something different? What if nothing?" Mrs. Chen interrupted. "You can spend the rest of your life asking what if, or you can spend it deciding what now. Which one is going to change your situation? What now?" It was such a simple question, but it cut through all my self-recrimination and guilt and forced me to focus on what actually mattered. Not the past I couldn't change, but the future I could still fight for. "I need help," I said finally. "I need someone who knows how to handle this kind of thing. A lawyer, maybe?" Mrs. Chen smiled. "My nephew is a lawyer. Family law, elder advocacy, that sort of thing. Let me call him." That's how I met David Chen, a man in his 40s with his aunt's kind eyes and a sharp intelligence that made me feel, for the first time in months, like maybe I wasn't completely powerless. He came to my house that same evening, listened to my story without interruption, and reviewed the documents I'd compiled with the focused attention of someone who actually cared about the details. When I finished, he sat back and looked at me seriously. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm going to be straight with you. This is bad. What your son has done is criminal fraud, elder abuse, and possibly attempted financial exploitation. You have grounds to press charges, to get restraining orders, to protect yourself legally in ways that would ensure he can never do this again." "But," I said, hearing the hesitation in his voice, "but it's going to be hard. Cases like this, where adult children exploit their parents, are emotionally devastating for everyone involved. The legal system will take time. Kevin will likely fight back. Maybe try to claim you're mentally incompetent or that you gave him permission for these transactions. It's going to get ugly." I thought about that. About Kevin standing in front of a judge, probably lying, probably painting me as a confused old woman who didn't know what she was talking about the fight that was coming, the ugliness that would be made public, the family I'd worked so hard to build completely destroyed beyond any hope of repair. And then I thought about him stepping over me on that kitchen floor, about the coldness in his eyes when he said, "It's your time already," about Rachel's threats and his stealing and the systematic way he'd been working to erase me from my own life. "I want to fight," I said quietly. "I want to stop him, whatever it takes." David Chen smiled. "Then let's get to work." David Chen came back the next day with a plan. Not just any plan, a careful, strategic approach that made me realize how serious this had become. He spread documents across my kitchen table, the same table where Kevin had tried to hide his papers, and I felt a strange sense of justice in reclaiming this space for my own defense. "First," David said, his voice calm and professional, "we need to secure your assets immediately. Change all your passwords, get new credit cards, set up alerts for any activity on your accounts. If Kevin has been accessing your information, we cut off that access right now." I nodded, taking notes on a pad of paper. It felt good to be doing something, to be taking action instead of just being acted upon. "Second, we file a police report. I know that's hard, but it creates an official record of what's happened. It also protects you if Kevin tries to claim later that you gave him permission." "Will he be arrested?" I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. David's expression softened. "Maybe. Probably not immediately. But Mrs. Morrison, Alice, you need to understand something. Kevin isn't going to stop on his own. People who do what he's done, they escalate. If we don't stop him now, legally and completely, he'll find another way to get what he wants. What he wants. My house, my money, my complete erasure." "What else?" I asked. "We file for a restraining order. No contact, no access to your property. We also need to make sure your will is updated, your power of attorney documents are secured, and that you have protection in place in case he tries to claim you're incompetent." The word hung in the air. Incompetent. That's what Kevin would say, wasn't it? That his poor, confused mother didn't understand what she was doing, that she was old and sick and not thinking clearly. "I'm not incompetent," I said firmly. "I know that. But we need to prove it. Document it. I'm going to recommend you get a full cognitive evaluation from a doctor. It might seem like overkill, but if this goes to court, and it probably will, we want every piece of evidence on our side." Over the next week, I followed David's instructions to the letter. I changed every password, using combinations so complex I had to write them down and hide them in a place Kevin would never think to look. I got new credit cards with different numbers. I set up alerts that would notify me of any transaction over $10. The bank was helpful once I explained the situation. They flagged my accounts with special security measures and gave me a direct line to a fraud specialist. The woman who set everything up looked at me with such sympathy that I almost started crying right there at her desk. "You're doing the right thing," she told me. "I see cases like this more often than you'd think. Adult children who see their aging parents as opportunities. It's heartbreaking, but you're being smart about protecting yourself." The police report was harder. I had to sit in a small, sterile room at the station and tell a detective everything, about the heart attack, about Kevin leaving me there, about the forged signatures and stolen money. The detective, a woman in her 50s named Martinez, listened without judgment, but I could see something in her eyes. Pity, maybe. Or recognition. "Does he live with you?" she asked. "No, but he had a key. He'd come over sometimes when I wasn't home." "Had a key?" "I changed the locks yesterday." Detective Martinez nodded approvingly. "Good, that's good. Mrs. Morrison, I want you to know that what you're describing is a pattern we see in elder abuse cases. The isolation, the financial exploitation, the attempt to make you doubt yourself. Your son's behavior fits a profile. A profile. As if Kevin was just another statistic, another case study in how children could turn on their parents. "What happens now?" I asked. "We'll investigate. Talk to the credit card companies, the bank, see if we can trace where the money went. We'll try to contact your son for his side of the story, and depending on what we find, the district attorney will decide whether to pursue charges." "How long will that take?" She hesitated. "Could be months. These cases are complicated, especially when it's family. But you've done the hardest part already. You've come forward. A lot of people don't." I understood what she wasn't saying. A lot of people chose to protect their abusers because they couldn't face the alternative. They chose to keep pretending everything was fine rather than acknowledge that the people they loved most had betrayed them. I'd almost been one of those people. Part of me still wanted to be. The cognitive evaluation was scheduled for the following Monday. David had recommended a doctor who specialized in geriatric assessments, someone who could provide documentation that would hold up in court if needed. I spent the days before the appointment in a state of strange anxiety. What if I failed? What if my heart attack had affected my brain somehow? What if Kevin was right, and I really was losing my grip on reality? Mrs. Chen noticed my worry. She'd started spending more time at my house, showing up with groceries or offers to help with chores. I think she was afraid to leave me alone too long, afraid that Kevin might show up, or that I might spiral into despair when no one was watching. "You're sharp as ever," she assured me. "Sharper than most people half your age. Stop worrying." But I couldn't help it. So much depended on that evaluation. My independence, my home, my ability to fight back against what Kevin had done. The test itself was exhausting. Hours of questions, memory exercises, problem-solving tasks. The doctor, a patient woman named Dr. Patel, walked me through everything carefully, explaining what she was testing and why. At the end, she sat down with me and smiled. "Mrs. Morrison, your cognitive function is excellent. Better than average for your age group, actually. There's no evidence of dementia, no significant memory loss, no impairment in your decision-making abilities. Frankly, you're doing remarkably well, especially considering the stress you've been under." The relief was so intense I nearly cried. "So, I'm not losing my mind?" "Not even close. You're a sharp, capable woman who's been through a traumatic experience. That's very different from cognitive decline." I left her office with official documentation stating that I was mentally competent, fully capable of managing my own affairs, and in no need of any kind of guardianship or conservatorship. It was just a piece of paper, but it felt like armor. Kevin called 2 days later. I saw his name on my phone screen and my first instinct was not to answer. But David had told me to document everything, to keep records of all contact. So I answered, but I also hit the record button on the app David had helped me install. "Mom." His voice was tight, angry. "What the hell is going on? I just got a call from some detective asking me questions about credit card fraud." "What did you tell them?" "I told them the truth," I said, keeping my voice steady. "That you've been using my credit cards without permission, that you forged my signature, that you stole $30,000 from me." Silence. Then, "I can't believe you'd do this. I'm your son." "Yes," I said quietly. "You are. And you left me to die on my kitchen floor. That's not—" "You're twisting everything. I was in shock, Mom. I didn't know what to do. You knew how to dial 911. You chose not to." "This is insane." His voice was rising now, losing the careful control. "You're insane. You've always been dramatic and paranoid, but this is a new low. Calling the police on your own son? What kind of mother does that?" "The kind who's finally decided to stop being a victim," I thought. But what I said was, "the kind whose son stole from her, the kind whose son tried to manipulate her into selling her house, the kind whose son saw her dying and walked away." You're going to regret this," Kevin said, his voice dropping to something darker. You think you can fight me? You think you can win? Mom, I have lawyers. I have resources. I have evidence that you're not fit to live alone. You're going to end up in a facility anyway, but now it'll be a state-run one instead of the nice place Rachel and I found. Is that what you want? What I want, I said, surprised by how calm I sounded, is for you to stay away from me. I've changed the locks. I've reported the fraud. I've documented everything. And if you come near my house or contact me again, I'll file for a restraining order. A restraining order. He laughed, sharp and bitter. Against your own son? Do you know how that's going to look? Everyone will think you've lost your mind. Let them think what they want. I know the truth. More importantly, the police know the truth. The bank knows the truth. My lawyer knows the truth. Your lawyer? Another pause. Jesus Christ, Mom. You actually hired a lawyer? Yes, and he's very good at what he does. I could hear Kevin breathing on the other end of the line, could almost feel him recalculating, trying to figure out his next move. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, softer now, almost pleading. Mom, please, let's not do this. Let's sit down and talk about this like adults. I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. Maybe I did use your card a few times, but it was for you, things you needed. You know how confused you've been getting lately. Maybe you just forgot. I'm not confused, Kevin. I had a cognitive evaluation, full documentation that I'm completely competent. So you can stop trying to gaslight me. The silence that followed was different, heavier. I'd used the word he'd been dancing around, named the thing he'd been trying to do, make me doubt my own mind, my own memories, my own reality. Fine, he said finally, all pretense of warmth gone from his voice. If that's how you want to play this, fine. But don't come crying to me when you end up alone and broke with no one to take care of you. Don't expect me to be there when you really need help. You're making a huge mistake. And when you realize it, it'll be too late. Goodbye, Kevin. I hung up before he could respond, and immediately my hands started shaking. I'd done it. I'd stood up to him, refused his manipulation, held my ground. But God, it hurt. It hurt so much I could barely breathe. Mrs. Chen found me sitting on the kitchen floor 20 minutes later, crying so hard I couldn't speak. She didn't ask questions. She just sat down beside me, put her arm around my shoulders, and let me sob. It's okay, she murmured. It's okay to grieve. You're not just losing a son. You're losing the dream of who you thought he was. That's worth crying over. She was right. I wasn't crying for Kevin as he was now. I was crying for the little boy who used to hold my hand, who used to say, I love you, Mommy, before bed, who used to make me cards for Mother's Day with crayons and construction paper. That boy was gone. Maybe he'd never really existed except in my desperate need to believe I was loved. That night, I took out a piece of paper and wrote something I'd never written before. Not a letter to Kevin. There was nothing left to say to him, but a letter to myself, to the woman I'd been, the one who'd sacrificed everything and called it love. Dear Alice, I wrote, you deserved better. You deserved a son who valued your sacrifices instead of exploiting them. You deserved to be loved the way you loved him. You deserved protection instead of betrayal. And you deserve right now to fight for yourself with the same fierce dedication you once fought for him. You are not done. You are not defeated. You are just beginning. I folded the letter and put it in my wallet, where I'd see it every day. A reminder, a promise, not to the mother I'd been, but to the woman I was becoming, someone who didn't just endure, someone who fought back. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. David explained that we'd have to go before a judge, present our evidence, and Kevin would have the opportunity to respond. It was a formal process, and I'd have to face my son in a courtroom while strangers decided whether he was dangerous enough to be kept away from his own mother. I spent those 3 weeks preparing, not just gathering documents, though there were plenty of those, but preparing myself emotionally for what was coming. I knew Kevin wouldn't go quietly. I knew he'd fight back, probably claim I was confused or vindictive or suffering from some mental breakdown. David had warned me that abusers often became most dangerous when they realized they were losing control. He's going to try to make you doubt yourself, David said during one of our preparation sessions. He'll say things designed to hurt you, to make you feel guilty. You need to be ready for that. I nodded, but I wasn't sure anyone could be ready for their own child to attack them in public. Mrs. Chen helped me choose what to wear to the hearing. Something dignified but not too formal, professional but not cold. We settled on a navy blue dress I'd bought years ago for a wedding, paired with a cardigan that made me look, in Mrs. Chen's words, like the respectable woman you are, not someone who's losing her grip on reality. The morning of the hearing, I woke up before dawn. My heart was racing, not the dangerous racing of a cardiac event, but the anxious pounding of someone about to do something terrifying and necessary. I made coffee, ate toast I could barely taste, and tried not to think about the fact that in a few hours, I'd be sitting across from Kevin in a courtroom. Mrs. Chen drove me to the courthouse. David met us outside, carrying a briefcase full of documents and wearing the kind of serious expression that made me feel simultaneously protected and terrified. "Are you ready?" he asked. No, I thought. But what I said was, yes. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, less dramatic than the ones on television. Fluorescent lights, beige walls, rows of benches that reminded me uncomfortably of church pews. Kevin was already there, sitting with a lawyer of his own, a young woman in an expensive suit who looked like she'd never known a day of struggle in her life. Kevin didn't look at me when I walked in. He kept his eyes forward, his jaw tight, his whole posture radiating controlled anger. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the edge of the table. He was nervous. Good. Rachel sat in the gallery behind him, her face a mask of cold judgment. When our eyes met, she didn't look away. She wanted me to know she was there, that I was alone in this fight against both of them, but I wasn't alone. Mrs. Chen sat directly behind me, and I could feel her presence like a shield at my back. The judge was a woman in her 60s, gray hair pulled back severely, reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked tired, like she'd seen too many ugly family situations, and no longer had the energy to be surprised by human cruelty. Case number 2024 RO 3847, the clerk announced. Alice Morrison petitioning for a restraining order against Kevin Morrison. David stood and began presenting our case. He was methodical, calm, laying out the evidence piece by piece. The forged credit card signatures, the unauthorized charges totaling $30,000, the bank statements showing systematic theft over 18 months, the police report documenting financial elder abuse. Your Honor, David said, Mrs. Morrison's son has engaged in a calculated pattern of exploitation and manipulation. He has stolen from her, attempted to coerce her into selling her home, and when she suffered a life-threatening medical emergency, he abandoned her rather than calling for help. Kevin's lawyer stood immediately. Your Honor, these are serious accusations being made against my client based on misunderstandings and, frankly, the confused perceptions of an elderly woman who has recently suffered a major health crisis. There it was. The attack David had warned me about. Mrs. Morrison underwent a comprehensive cognitive evaluation just last week, David countered smoothly, sliding a document across to the judge. Dr. Patel's assessment shows no cognitive impairment whatsoever. In fact, Mrs. Morrison tested above average for her age group in all areas of mental function. The judge reviewed the document, her expression unreadable. Your Honor, if I may, Kevin's lawyer continued, my client has been nothing but concerned for his mother's well-being. The charges Mrs. Morrison references were made with her permission. For household expenses and medical costs, she was unable to manage herself. My client has been trying to help his mother transition to appropriate care because he's worried about her safety living alone. I felt anger surge through me, hot and clarifying. He was lying, sitting there in his expensive suit, flanked by his expensive lawyer, lying about everything. That's not true, I said, my voice cutting through the courtroom before I could stop myself. The judge looked at me. Mrs. Morrison, you'll have an opportunity to speak. Please wait until you're called. I sat back, my face burning. Mrs. Chen's hand found my shoulder and squeezed gently. The judge turned to Kevin. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to give you a chance to respond to these allegations directly. Did you or did you not use your mother's credit cards without her explicit permission? Kevin stood, and I saw him slip into the version of himself he showed the world. charming, reasonable, the successful son who'd done everything right. Your Honor, I did occasionally use my mother's cards, but only because she asked me to. She'd call me, confused about her bills or worried about her finances, and I'd help her out. I'd pick up groceries, pay for her medications, things like that. I always thought she understood what I was doing. And the signatures on the charge authorizations? Mom's hands shake sometimes. I'd help her sign documents when she was having trouble. I never thought— He paused, his voice catching just slightly. I never thought she'd interpret that as theft. I was just trying to help. It was a masterful performance. If I didn't know better, if I hadn't lived through his coldness and calculation, I might have believed him myself. Your Honor, may I present additional evidence? David asked. The judge nodded, and David produced his phone. This is a recording of a phone conversation between Mrs. Morrison and her son, made with her full knowledge that she was recording just 2 weeks ago. My stomach clenched. The recording, the conversation where Kevin had threatened me, where he'd dropped his mask completely. David played it for the court. Kevin's voice filled the small room sharp with anger. You're going to regret this. You think you can fight me? I have lawyers. I have resources. I have evidence that you're not fit to live alone. I watched the judge's expression change as she listened, watched Kevin's face go pale, watched his lawyer lean over to whisper something urgent in his ear. When the recording ended, the courtroom was silent. Mr. Morrison, the judge said, her voice colder now. That doesn't sound like a son who's concerned for his mother's well-being. That sounds like a threat. Kevin's lawyer stood quickly. Your Honor, my client was understandably upset. He'd just been accused of serious crimes by his own mother. People say things they don't mean when they're emotional. Does your client have a history of this kind of behavior? The judge interrupted. No, Your Honor. This is completely out of character. Your Honor, David interjected. We have testimony from Mrs. Morrison's neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who witnessed Mr. Morrison's behavior on multiple occasions. She's prepared to testify that he was consistently dismissive and cold toward his mother, and that she personally found Mrs. Morrison collapsed in her home after Mr. Morrison had left her there during a medical emergency. The judge looked at Mrs. Chen. Is this true, ma'am? Mrs. Chen stood, her voice clear and steady. Yes, Your Honor. I found Alice on her kitchen floor, barely conscious, after having a heart attack. Her son had been there that morning. He left her there to die. I heard Rachel gasp behind Kevin, and I wondered if he'd told her that part. If she'd known all this time that her husband had left his mother to die, or if that had been one of the many lies he'd told to everyone in his life. The judge removed her glasses and looked at Kevin for a long moment. Mr. Morrison, I'm not here to determine whether you committed fraud. That's a matter for criminal court. But I am here to determine whether your presence poses a threat to your mother's well-being. And based on what I've seen and heard today, I believe it does. Kevin's lawyer tried to speak again, but the judge held up her hand. I'm granting the restraining order. Mr. Morrison, you are not to contact your mother in any way. No phone calls, no emails, no text messages, no visits. You are not to come within 500 feet of her residence. This order is effective immediately and will remain in place for 1 year, at which point Mrs. Morrison can petition to extend it if she feels it's necessary. Do you understand? Kevin stood frozen, his face a mixture of shock and fury. His lawyer touched his arm, whispered something, and finally he nodded stiffly. Yes, Your Honor. Good. This hearing is adjourned. The gavel came down, and just like that, it was over. Kevin was ordered to stay away from me. Legally, officially, he could no longer hurt me. I sat there, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. Mrs. Chen's arms came around me from behind, and I heard her voice in my ear. You did it, Alice. You stood up for yourself, and you won. But it didn't feel like winning. Not yet. It felt like grief, like loss, like the final severing of a bond I'd spent 67 years believing was unbreakable. David packed up his briefcase, professional satisfaction on his face. This is good, Alice. Very good. The restraining order strengthens our case if the DA decides to pursue criminal charges. And it protects you while we work on recovering the stolen money. Kevin walked past us on his way out of the courtroom. For just a moment, his mask slipped, and I saw pure hatred in his eyes. Not anger, hatred. For me, for his own mother. "You'll regret this," he said quietly, just loud enough for me to hear. "You think you've won, but you haven't. You're going to die alone, and I'll be there to watch it happen." Rachel grabbed his arm, pulling him away before security could hear what he'd said. But I'd heard it. Mrs. Chen had heard it. And David had heard it too. "That's a direct violation of the restraining order," David said quietly. "He just made contact and he threatened you. I can have him arrested right now if you want." I watched Kevin's back as he walked away, Rachel hissing something at him, his shoulders rigid with rage. My son, the little boy I'd raised, the man who wanted me dead. "Not yet," I said. "Let him think he got away with it. Let him think he still has some power. People like Kevin always make mistakes when they think they're untouchable." David looked at me with something like respect. "You're learning." "No," I said softly. "I've always known how to survive. I just finally decided I was worth fighting for." Outside the courthouse, the sun was shining, birds were singing, and the world continued its indifferent spin. Mrs. Chen drove me home, and for the first time in months, I walked into my house without fear. Kevin couldn't come here anymore. The law had put a barrier between us that even his cruelty couldn't cross. That night, I slept better than I had since before my heart attack. I dreamed, but not the nightmares I'd been having. I dreamed I was standing in an open field, and the ground beneath my feet was solid and sure, and I wasn't afraid anymore. When I woke up, the sun was streaming through my bedroom window, and I realized something had changed. The grief was still there. I don't think that kind of loss ever completely goes away, but alongside it was something else. Something harder and clearer and more powerful than anything I'd felt in years. It wasn't hope, exactly. It was determination. The absolute certainty that I was going to survive this, and not just survive. I was going to take back everything Kevin had stolen from me. My money, my peace, my life. But I had no idea that the real fight was just beginning. Kevin waited exactly 1 week before making his move, long enough for me to start believing the restraining order would actually protect me, short enough that I should have known better. It started with an email, not to me directly, which would have violated the order, but to Mrs. Chen. The subject line read, "Concerns about Alice Morrison." Mrs. Chen showed it to me immediately, her face tight with anger. The email was professional, almost clinical in tone. Kevin expressed worry about my deteriorating mental state and suggested that Mrs. Chen, as a concerned neighbor, should contact Adult Protective Services. He claimed I'd been making irrational decisions, isolating myself, showing signs of paranoia and delusion. He even suggested I might be a danger to myself. "He's trying to get someone else to do his dirty work," David said when I called him. "This is a common tactic. If he can get APS involved, if he can plant seeds of doubt about your competency, he can still get what he wants without technically violating the restraining order." What do I do? Nothing yet. Keep that email. Document everything. If APS does show up, you have Dr. Patel's evaluation showing you're completely competent. They'll investigate, find nothing wrong, and close the case. It'll actually help us show a pattern of harassment. But 3 days later, something happened that David's legal expertise couldn't have predicted. I was in my garden, a small space behind the house where I'd been trying to grow tomatoes and herbs, something to fill the empty days and give me a reason to go outside. It was late afternoon, the sun warm on my shoulders, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. That's when I saw Rachel at my back fence. She wasn't supposed to be there. The restraining order technically only applied to Kevin, but David had warned them both to stay away from my property entirely. Yet there she was, standing in the alley behind my house, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Alice," she called out, her voice carrying across the small yard. "I need to talk to you." Every instinct told me to go inside, to ignore her, to call David immediately. But something in her voice stopped me. She didn't sound angry. She sounded broken. "You need to leave," I said, staying where I was. "You're not supposed to be here." "I know. I needed to see you, to tell you something." I should have walked away, but curiosity, and maybe some small, desperate hope that she'd come to apologize, to acknowledge what Kevin had done, kept me standing there. "I'm listening," I said. Rachel looked around, as if checking to see if anyone was watching, then spoke quickly. "I didn't know. About the credit cards? About the money. Kevin told me you'd given him permission for everything. He said you were getting forgetful, that you'd asked him to help manage your finances. And you believed him? Why wouldn't I? He's my husband. She stopped, her voice catching. "He's supposed to be a good person." Supposed to be. Past tense. Something had changed. "What happened?" I asked, moving slightly closer. Rachel's hand went to her purse, a nervous gesture. "I found documents. In his office at home. Papers he didn't want me to see. Alice, he's been planning this for almost 2 years. Before your heart attack. Before any of this. He has spreadsheets showing your assets, your income, projected costs of care facilities. He's been researching guardianship laws, looking for ways to get control of your house." The confirmation of what I'd suspected still hit like a punch to the stomach. 2 years. He'd been planning to destroy me for 2 years. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "Because I found something else. A life insurance policy. On you. That Kevin took out 6 months ago. With himself as the beneficiary. A big one. $500,000. The world tilted sideways. A life insurance policy. On me. Taken out after my heart attack. After I'd become what Kevin saw as a liability rather than a mother. "That's not legal," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You can't take out life insurance on someone without their knowledge." "He forged your signature," Rachel said, "just like he did with the credit cards. I have copies of everything. I made them before I came here because I knew if I told you I couldn't stay with him anymore, and he'll destroy any evidence he can get his hands on." She pulled an envelope from her purse and held it out. "This is everything. The policy, the guardianship research, the spreadsheets. There's also something else. Emails between Kevin and a woman named Jennifer from some care facility. He's been negotiating a contract for you, Alice, for a state-run facility, not the nice place he told you about. One of those places where people go to die." My hands shook as I took the envelope. "Why would he choose a state facility if he wanted me somewhere nice?" Rachel's laugh was bitter. "Because they're cheaper. He needs you alive long enough to get guardianship, to force you to sell the house. But after that, the less he spends on your care, the more he keeps for himself. And the life insurance. If I died quickly, conveniently, after Kevin had control of my assets, he wanted me dead," I said, the words finally spoken aloud. "Not just gone. Not just out of the way. Dead." "I don't know," Rachel said, but her voice suggested she suspected the same thing I did. "I don't know how far he'd go. But Alice, I'm scared. The man I thought I married doesn't exist. The person I've been living with is someone I don't recognize. And if he could do this to you, to his own mother—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. "You need to go," I said, not unkindly. "Before someone sees you here and tells Kevin. He can't know you gave me this." Rachel nodded, already backing away. "I'm leaving him, filing for divorce. My lawyer said I can testify against him in the criminal case if it comes to that. I just wanted you to know. I wanted you to know I'm sorry. I should have questioned things sooner. I should have protected you instead of believing his lies." She turned and walked away quickly, disappearing around the corner before I could respond. I stood in my garden, clutching the envelope, understanding with crystal clarity that everything had just changed. This wasn't just financial abuse anymore. This was something darker, something that could have ended with my death looking like an unfortunate accident or natural decline of an elderly woman in state care. I went inside and called David immediately. He arrived 30 minutes later with Detective Martinez, who'd been working on my case since I filed the police report. I showed them everything Rachel had given me, the life insurance policy with my forged signature, the guardianship research, the emails about the care facility. Detective Martinez's face grew grimmer with each document. "Mrs. Morrison, this changes everything. This isn't just financial exploitation anymore. With the life insurance policy, we're looking at potential attempted fraud, possibly conspiracy. If we can prove intent—" She didn't finish, but I understood. If they could prove Kevin had taken out that policy with the intention of benefiting from my death, especially after leaving me to die during my heart attack. This became something much more serious than theft. "We need to move quickly," David said. "Kevin doesn't know we have this information yet, but once Rachel files for divorce, he'll suspect. We need to get ahead of it." That night, after David and Detective Martinez left, I sat at my kitchen table and thought about the little boy Kevin had been. I tried to pinpoint the exact moment when that sweet child had transformed into a man capable of plotting his own mother's death for money. But there was no single moment, just 1,000 small choices, 1,000 times when he'd chosen himself over everyone else, 1,000 instances of cruelty that I'd excused or ignored or explained away. I'd spent so much time asking what I'd done wrong, how I'd failed him, but sitting there with the evidence of his calculated malice spread before me, I finally understood. I hadn't failed him. I'd succeeded in raising him exactly as I'd intended. I'd just failed to see that giving him everything he wanted had taught him that he was entitled to take whatever he wanted from anyone, including me. The difference was that now, finally, I was going to stop him. The next morning, Detective Martinez called. "We've executed a search warrant on Kevin Morrison's home and office. We found additional evidence, more forged documents, communications with the insurance company, and something interesting, searches on his computer about inheritance laws and how long it typically takes for elderly people to die in state care facilities." My stomach turned. He was researching how long he'd have to wait. It appears so. "Mrs. Morrison, the district attorney wants to meet with you. They're considering multiple charges: elder abuse, fraud, forgery, and possibly attempted murder." Attempted murder. The words hung in the air, too big and terrible to fully comprehend. My son might go to prison for trying to kill me. "What do I need to do?" I asked. "Just tell the truth. Tell them everything, the same way you told me. They'll want to record your statement. Have you testify before a grand jury eventually. Are you prepared for that?" Was I prepared to stand in front of a grand jury and testify that my son had tried to kill me for money? Was I prepared for Kevin to be arrested, prosecuted, potentially spend years in prison? I thought about that moment on my kitchen floor, the pain in my chest, the coldness in Kevin's eyes as he said, "It's your time already." I thought about the months of planning, the forged signatures, the life insurance policy with my name on it. I thought about the care facility emails, the calculation of how much my death would be worth to him. "Yes," I said firmly. "I'm prepared." 2 days later, Kevin was arrested at his office. Detective Martinez called to tell me, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction. He didn't resist, claimed it was all a misunderstanding, that his ex-wife was lying to get back at him, that you were confused and vindictive, but the evidence speaks for itself. What happens now? Arraignment tomorrow. Given the severity of the charges and the evidence we have, I expect they'll set bail high. He might not be able to post it. Kevin, my successful financial advisor's son, might spend the next few months in jail while awaiting trial. The irony wasn't lost on me. Mrs. Chen came over that evening with dinner, homemade soup and fresh bread, comfort food for a day that had been anything but comfortable. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where this had all started, where Kevin had hidden his papers and plotted my destruction. "How do you feel?" Mrs. Chen asked. I thought about it, like I'm waking up from a nightmare, but also like the nightmare is finally going to end. "What will you do after all this is over?" It was a good question. What did I do with the rest of my life, now that I'd survived the person who was supposed to love me most, trying to end it? "Live," I said simply. "Really live, not just survive. Maybe travel. Maybe make new friends. Maybe volunteer somewhere and actually help people instead of being someone's victim." Mrs. Chen smiled. "You were never just a victim, Alice. You were a survivor who decided to become a fighter. There's a difference." That night, I had a dream. I was standing at a crossroads, and Kevin was behind me, calling my name, demanding that I come back. But ahead of me was a path I'd never taken before, one that led somewhere I couldn't quite see, but that looked bright and open and full of possibility. In the dream, I turned my back on Kevin and walked toward the light. And when I woke up, I knew that's exactly what I was going to do in real life. Walk away from the past and toward whatever future I could build for myself. A future where I wasn't defined by being Kevin's mother, Kevin's victim, or Kevin's target. Just Alice. A woman who'd survived, a woman who'd fought back, a woman who was finally, after 67 years, ready to live for herself. The trial took 8 months to reach court. 8 months of depositions, witness interviews, and legal maneuvering. 8 months during which I rebuilt my life piece by piece, like someone assembling a puzzle after all the pieces had been scattered across the floor. David worked tirelessly to recover the money Kevin had stolen. The credit card companies, once they saw the evidence of forgery, reversed most of the charges. The bank froze Kevin's accounts and began the process of restitution. It would take time, legal processes always did, but for the first time in years, I could see a future where I wasn't drowning in debt I hadn't created. The house was mine, secured and protected by legal documents that even Kevin's lawyers couldn't challenge. I had my cognitive evaluation, my medical records, and a restraining order that had been extended for 5 years. On paper, at least, I was safe. But the emotional recovery took longer than any legal process. Mrs. Chen remained a constant presence, but she did something I'll always be grateful for. She didn't just take care of me. She helped me learn to take care of myself again. She taught me how to check my credit report, how to set up fraud alerts, how to manage my finances with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that trust was a privilege, not a right. "You're strong, Alice," she'd say when I felt overwhelmed. "Stronger than you give yourself credit for. You survived something that would have destroyed other people. Don't forget that." I joined a support group for victims of financial elder abuse. Sitting in that circle of people, mostly women, mostly mothers who'd been betrayed by the children they'd raised, I realized I wasn't alone. There was Margaret, whose daughter had stolen her retirement savings. There was Dorothy, whose son had forged her name on a reverse mortgage. There was Linda, whose entire family had conspired to have her declared incompetent so they could take control of her assets. We were a community of survivors, bound together by the cruelest kind of betrayal. And we were strong in ways that people who'd never experienced this kind of violation could never understand. We'd been broken and had chosen to heal. We'd been victimized and had chosen to fight back. We'd been told we were worthless and had decided to prove otherwise. The day of the trial arrived on a cold morning in late November. The courthouse was the same one where I'd gotten the restraining order, but this time the stakes were different. This time, Kevin faced years in prison if convicted. I wore the same navy dress I'd worn to the restraining order hearing. Mrs. Chen said it was my armor now, the outfit I wore when I needed to remember my own strength. The courtroom was full. Rachel was there, sitting with her own lawyer, having filed for divorce and agreed to testify for the prosecution. Detective Martinez sat in the gallery, along with several other people I didn't recognize, probably reporters, drawn by the sensational nature of a son accused of trying to murder his mother for insurance money. Kevin sat at the defense table in an expensive suit that probably cost more than my monthly pension. He'd lost weight during the months of legal proceedings, and there were dark circles under his eyes. But when he looked at me, I saw no remorse. Only cold calculation, as if he were still trying to figure out how to win, how to manipulate the situation to his advantage. The prosecutor was a woman named Sarah Chen, no relation to Mrs. Chen, though the coincidence made me smile. She was young, fierce, and had told me during our preparation meetings that she'd taken this case personally because her own grandmother had been exploited by a nephew before Sarah became a lawyer. "Cases like this," she'd said, "they're about more than just one victim. They're about sending a message that elder abuse has consequences, that you can't prey on the people who loved and raised you without facing justice." The trial lasted 3 days. 3 days of testimony, evidence, and careful legal arguments that laid bare every terrible thing Kevin had done. Rachel testified about the documents she'd found, the life insurance policy, the emails about care facilities. Detective Martinez testified about the searches on Kevin's computer, the pattern of forged signatures, the systematic theft. Bank representatives testified about the unauthorized transactions. The insurance agent testified that Kevin had lied about my health status to get the policy approved. Dr. Patel testified about my cognitive evaluation, making it clear that I was fully competent and aware of everything that had happened to me. And then it was my turn. I walked to the witness stand on legs that shook despite my determination to appear strong. The prosecutor smiled at me encouragingly. and I saw Mrs. Chen in the gallery, her hands clasped as if in prayer. Sarah Chen led me through my testimony gently but thoroughly. She asked me to describe the day of my heart attack, to tell the jury exactly what Kevin had said and done. She asked about the years of sacrifice, the jobs I'd worked, the dreams I'd deferred so my son could have opportunities I'd never had. "Mrs. Morrison," she said, "when you discovered your son had taken out a life insurance policy on you without your knowledge, what went through your mind?" I looked at the jury, 12 ordinary people who'd been pulled from their lives to sit in judgment of mine, and I told them the truth. I realized he'd been waiting for me to die, that all the pressure to sell my house, all the talk about care facilities, it was never about my safety or well-being. It was about positioning himself to benefit from my death, and I understood that if I'd gone along with his plan, if I'd trusted him and done what he wanted, I probably wouldn't be here today. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of someone crying softly in the gallery. "When your son left you on the floor during your heart attack," Sarah continued, "what were you thinking? That I'd been wrong about everything, that the person I'd loved most in the world, the child I'd given everything to, saw me as nothing more than an obstacle, and that if I survived, which I didn't think I would, I could never trust him again. Do you still love your son, Mrs. Morrison?" It was a cruel question, but a necessary one. I saw Kevin's lawyer lean forward, ready to object if my answer helped the prosecution, but I didn't hesitate. I love the little boy he used to be. I mourn the man I thought he'd become, but the person sitting over there? I looked directly at Kevin for the first time since taking the stand. I don't know him, and no, I don't love someone who tried to kill me for money. Kevin's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Anger, maybe, or the realization that he'd finally, completely, lost control of the narrative he'd been trying to spin. The defense called Kevin to testify in his own defense. It was a calculated risk, but his lawyers probably felt they had no choice. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Their only hope was that he could charm the jury, convince them that this was all a tragic misunderstanding. Kevin's testimony was a masterclass in manipulation. He spoke of his worry for me, his genuine concern that I was declining mentally. He claimed the credit card charges were for things I'd asked him to buy. He insisted the life insurance policy was a precaution, that he'd meant to tell me about it, but had forgotten in the chaos of dealing with my health crisis. "I love my mother," he said, his voice catching just slightly. "Everything I did because I was trying to protect her. I never wanted to hurt her. The fact that she thinks I did breaks my heart." It was convincing. If I didn't know better, if I hadn't lived through his coldness and calculation, I might have believed him myself. But Sarah Chen was ready. "Mr. Morrison," she said during cross-examination, "you testified that you love your mother. Is that correct?" "Yes. And yet, when she was having a heart attack on her kitchen floor, you left her there without calling for help. Can you explain that?" Kevin's jaw tightened. I was in shock. I didn't realize how serious it was. "You didn't realize a woman clutching her chest, unable to breathe, saying she needed help, was having a serious medical emergency? I thought she was being dramatic. She's..." He stopped himself, but the damage was done. "She's what, Mr. Morrison? Overly emotional? Attention-seeking? Is that what you were going to say about a woman who'd just had a heart attack?" "Objection," Kevin's lawyer called out, badgering the witness. "Sustained," the judge said. "Move on, Ms. Chen." But the jury had heard it. They'd seen Kevin start to criticize me, to suggest that my near-death experience was somehow my fault, evidence of my dramatic nature rather than a legitimate medical crisis. Sarah continued methodically, walking Kevin through every piece of evidence, watching him fumble for explanations that grew increasingly implausible. The forged signatures that looked exactly like mine because he'd practiced. The life insurance policy he'd taken out right after my heart attack. The computer searches about how long elderly people survived in state care. "These searches were made from your computer, Mr. Morrison. Can you explain why you were researching the average lifespan of people in state-run care facilities at the same time you were trying to convince your mother to enter one?" "I was just gathering information to help her make an informed decision. Information about how long she might live? That seems like an odd thing to research for someone you claim to love and want to protect." Kevin had no good answer to that. No one did. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. 6 hours during which I sat in a small waiting room with Mrs. Chen, unable to eat, unable to think about anything except what would happen if they found him not guilty. Would I have to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering if Kevin would try again? But when the jury returned, their faces told me everything I needed to know before the foreman even spoke. On the count of elder abuse in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of financial exploitation, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of forgery, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of insurance fraud, we find the defendant guilty. 4 guilty verdicts. 4 times the word rang out in the courtroom, final and irrevocable. I watched Kevin's face as each verdict was read. He didn't cry. He didn't show remorse. He just stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, as if he still couldn't believe he'd lost. Sentencing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Sarah told me that Kevin faced anywhere from 5 to 15 years in prison, depending on the judge's discretion. Rachel's testimony had been devastating, and the life insurance policy, while not resulting in an attempted murder charge due to lack of definitive proof of intent, had painted a picture of someone willing to profit from his mother's death. On the day of sentencing, the judge asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement. I'd prepared something, written and rewritten it dozens of times, trying to find the right words to express the magnitude of what had been taken from me. I stood before the court, looking at Kevin one final time, and I spoke from my heart. Your Honor, Kevin Morrison is my son. I gave birth to him. I raised him alone after his father died. I worked 2 jobs to give him opportunities I never had. I sacrificed my health, my dreams, my entire life to make sure he had everything he needed. And when I needed him, when I was dying on my kitchen floor, he walked away. He didn't just fail to help me, he actively chose my death over his convenience. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the months of planning before that moment. The systematic theft, the forged signatures, the life insurance policy, the research into how long I might survive in the cheapest care facility he could find. The worst part was realizing that my son didn't just not love me, he'd calculated the exact value of my death. I will spend the rest of my life grieving the child I thought I had, but I will not spend it being his victim. I survived his cruelty, his greed, his complete lack of conscience, and I want this court to know that I am not asking for mercy for him. I am asking for justice, not just for me, but for every elderly person who trusts their children, who sacrifices for them, who believes that love is enough to prevent this kind of betrayal. It isn't my time, Your Honor, but it is time for Kevin to face the consequences of his choices. The judge sentenced Kevin to 12 years in prison, 12 years for destroying his mother's life, for stealing from her, for leaving her to die. It seemed both too much and too little, but it was justice, and sometimes that's all we can ask for. As they led Kevin away in handcuffs, he looked at me one last time. I waited for remorse, for some sign that he finally understood what he'd done, but there was nothing. Just emptiness where love should have been. Mrs. Chen drove me home from the courthouse. Home to the house that was mine, legally and completely mine, protected by laws and court orders, and the simple fact that I'd fought for it and won. "What will you do now?" she asked as we pulled into my driveway. I looked at my house, small, modest, nothing special to anyone else but everything to me. It represented more than just shelter. It represented survival, resistance, the refusal to let cruelty win. Live, I said simply. Really, truly live. Not for Kevin, not in spite of Kevin, just for me. And that's exactly what I did. I traveled, small trips at first, then bigger ones. I volunteered at the support group that had helped me, offering my story as proof that survival was possible. I made new friends, real friends, people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could give them. I planted a garden that flourished. I learned to paint. I wrote letters to my younger self, telling her that the pain ahead was real, but so was the strength she didn't know she possessed. I learned that being someone's mother didn't mean you had to accept being someone's victim. That love without respect was just exploitation. That sometimes the bravest thing you could do was walk away from people who didn't deserve you, even if they shared your blood. Kevin wrote to me from prison once. I burned the letter without opening it. I didn't need his words. his explanations or excuses or whatever he thought might repair what he'd broken. I needed my peace more than I needed his closure. I'm 70 now. 3 years have passed since that day on my kitchen floor. Since Kevin looked at me dying and said, "It's your time already." He was wrong. It wasn't my time then, and it isn't my time now. This is my time, my season, my life, finally lived on my own terms. And if there's one thing I want other women to know, women who've sacrificed everything for ungrateful children, women who've been betrayed by the people they loved most, women who wonder if it's too late to fight back, it's this. It's never too late. You are never too old. Your life is never too small to be worth fighting for. I learned that at 67, after my son tried to kill me for money. I learned it in a courtroom where justice finally showed up. I learned it from a neighbor who became a friend, from a lawyer who believed me, from a community of survivors who taught me that breaking doesn't mean you can't heal. And I'm still learning it every single day, in a house that belongs only to me, in a life that I rebuilt with my own trembling but determined hands. Kevin thought he could erase me. Instead, he freed me. And that, more than any prison sentence, is the real victory. This is Alice Morrison, survivor. Not victim, not mother of the year, not someone defined by what was done to her, just Alice. Finally, beautifully, defiantly alive. And it is exactly my time to thrive.